Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit more Civilization 6. So this is Civilization 6 in retrospective. We're going to be talking a little bit about the different factions as they are, and a little bit about what I think is good about this game, and maybe what could be a little bit worse. But more importantly, we're going to be doing this as a slightly different type of review than we have before. We're going to be talking about this in terms of whether you should buy this game or how this game would fit with you if you've never played a Civilization game before. So, Civilization games, I think, are one of those games that isn't really for everybody, so it's going to be important for you if you're getting a lot of hype about this game, if you're hearing a lot about this game, or if you're interested in trying it to sort of know what it's about. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that sort of stuff. For this first video, we'll be doing another video that'll go more in depth about the mechanics of Civilization 6. That is going to be comparing it to Civilization 5 and Beyond Earth a little bit more. So that's going to be more for veteran players who know a lot more about Civilization, who might want to know some sort of stuff about the game that, you know, maybe they're holding out on buying it just because they want to know a little bit more about it. Maybe they want to know whether it's good before they get it, and they're just holding off for the reviews. So that's going to be for those experienced Civilization players. But anyway, we're going to first of all start talking a little bit about what this game is. It's a 4X strategy game. It's pretty much the most well-known series of that style of game. It's a very iconic sort of franchise in that genre, and 4X basically means explore, expand, exploit, exterminate. Which basically means that you're running a kingdom, you're trying to figure out where is good to expand your kingdom, and then you're using the resources that you get from those expansions to then win the game. Now, you don't have to use military to expand, exterminate, etc. in this game. You could be doing it by exterminating their culture and making a cultural hegemony. You could be winning by making yours the only religion in the world. You can win by making... well, science has no real extermination analogy, but you could basically fly off into space and say, screw all of you hosers, I'm going to space. But yeah, it ultimately results in the same sort of general principle. You make your civilization the most advanced in one of those sort of categories, be it military, be it culture, be it science, and then you win the game using that, and that's sort of how these games work. So if that sounds like that's something up your alley, you've always had that sort of will to rule in your blood or something like that, then this could be a game that you might really want, and it might be an interesting one for you to try. Now, 4X games and all sorts of strategy games of that general genre are extremely slow in one respect or another. First of all, these games take a long time to learn. The learning curve is quite steep, so expect to not necessarily know what you're doing for quite a few iterations of the game. You're going to often have to spend a lot of time learning how to play this game before you're really... before it really clicks, before you get it. Not only is there a significant amount of knowledge that the game requires of the game, but just because you know what everything does, it doesn't mean that you know what you need to do. That's a sort of different issue entirely. So you're often going to find yourself having to figure out, you know, okay, well, I've got all of this sort of stuff here. What do I actually do with that? Here's an example. This is the tech tree. This is all the different technologies in the game. Knowing what these actually do, what these buildings do, what these buildings cost, that doesn't necessarily tell you what to build or what to research. And some of that's going to actually come down to each individual gameplay, because you're going to get boosts in different areas. Your resource tiles around you are going to be different in different playthroughs. The faction that you're playing could be different. You could be going for a different victory condition in your given game. And all of those change how you interpret that tech web. And there's another tech web over here from culture. So there's a lot of information to absorb, and that's something that even advanced players are going to have to do, is learn where everything fits into the meta of the game. And that's going to take some time, but also it's going to be one of those things that just is very, very difficult. So you might find yourself getting frustrated if you're the sort of person who gets easily frustrated by games and doesn't really want to have to learn anything too advanced or complicated. Then this might not be necessarily a very good game for you. If you're that sort of gamer, you know, there's literally nothing wrong with that. Just go ahead and play something that's a little bit more fast-paced. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But yeah, you just have to acknowledge that this kind of game is very, very slow, is very, very difficult to learn, very high learning curve. So just because this game, though, is slow, don't worry too much. game will typically take 6 hours. I've heard some people say that they don't want to play a 4X strategy game because the games take too long to play. That's not really a big concern that you should have. I mean, there's really no reason whatsoever that you couldn't just play for an hour, turn the game off, and then play again the next day. I think that that's perfectly viable. So, you know, there's no reason that you should worry about that particular element to this. I think that if that's what's holding you back, you know, don't worry about it, basically. Next up, so what makes a good 4X strategy game, and is this a good one? And, you know, maybe you're the sort of person who doesn't like good 4X strategy games, maybe you'd actually like a bad one. I'm being serious, I can empathize with that. I like fighting games that people who like fighting games don't like, because I like story-driven games. And they don't seem to care about the story at all. They just seem to care about the lore of the characters and beating people up mechanics, so... yeah, that's an interesting thought there. But what makes a good 4X strategy game for people who are a big fan of the genre, is that it has good... I would say that it has good faction balance and good and interesting factions, varied factions, all of that other sort of different things, so that you've got some replayability there. Every game in this genre pretty much has some replayability from the fact that they randomly generate maps. I haven't found a game in this genre that really doesn't generate maps randomly. There probably are some, but I can't think of any coming to mind right now. So this game does do that sort of thing, but the factions in this game are actually some of the best I've seen in a strategy game in a while of this genre, and I think that's because they've got sort of really iconic abilities. They've got abilities that fit in with what you would expect them to have, as well as they're fairly well balanced. So if I'm playing the game with one faction, I can play it again as another and not only get a very different experience, I'm going to get a different experience that's not necessarily too powerful compared to others. I'm not going to pick one just because I think that it's going to let me win the game. There is one right now that is unbalanced in a sense. It's Tomiris, who's got the ability to produce 2 horsemen at once. She can actually just produce 2 horsemen at once and then sell one of them off, and you end up making a ton of money that way, which other factions can't. If they try to produce things and then make money by selling it, they're actually losing production time, which is worth more than money. Her trade-off, though, like her conversion rate is so good in her favor that she can just keep building stuff and then selling it. It's kind of funny, but people think that that's probably going to get patched out, and I kind of agree with that. I suspect that she's going to have the ability to sell those guys back at half rate, is probably what they're going to do. So you never know, though. They might not do that. In any event, though, this game has a lot of sort of characteristics that you would want in a game like this. It has a lot of complexity. It has a lot of depth. Depth is something that people are going to talk about when they talk about these sorts of games, and that's basically the ability to sort of, like, master the game slowly, is what I would say it is. You start off with this sort of game and you think to yourself, okay, well, now I understand the basic controls of it. This isn't the sort of game where the basic controls of it really matters that much. You're going to get to that point, and that's lovely, but you're probably still going to get your ass kicked. And as you sort of peel back more and more layers of the game and figure out more and more about the mechanics of the game and the actual math behind those mechanics, you're going to be finding that you're getting better and better at it, and I think that that's sort of the important sort of part of these sorts of games. Of course, that's the case for every type of game, but these types of games have a lot more that you can learn and a lot more that you can get from them in that sort of sense, and I think that that's quite important. This game does have quite a lot of that depth for a 4X game. It's not the most depth that I've ever seen. It's not the most complexity, but there's a lot of different parts that require a significant amount of mastery that I think is going to make it very, very hard to fully master, and I think that that's what we're looking for in a game like this. It's a game that takes a long time to fully come to grips with. But that's just sort of my opinion on that matter. I think that those sorts of games are a little bit better than ones that are too easy, but we'll find out, I think, later how true that depth is. Maybe as people get better at this game, they're going to find out that's a little bit more of a shallow experience or something like that. That always does happen in some games. But for now, I think that this one's quite good for that. The next thing to note about this game is that it is aesthetically quite unique compared to other Civilization games. They've made it significantly more colorful. The colors are more cartoonish. People have said that they don't particularly like this. I'm actually pretty neutral to it. I think that it looks okay. I don't think it looks great either. So if you like the style, then you like the style, that's fine. I don't think, honestly, that it's also that important, personally. I'm not a huge graphics person, I'm not a huge visual effects person. As far as I care, it can look however it wants. But if this sort of aesthetic bothers you, then, you know, that's something to consider. They did do it, I should note, to make it more obvious what things are on the screen, and I actually think that they failed on that. So if we were to turn this off, it's not necessarily immediately clear, to me anyway, what everything is exactly. Actually, this is a pretty good map for clarity, because nothing's too crazy here. Like, we can see what this is, I think. Yeah, incense. But a lot of the time, a lot of the stuff doesn't look immediately obvious. If we go to the coast, things like crabs are not that easy to see without the icons. Like, what the hell is this over here? Apparently that's fish. Okay, so, you know, there's lots of things that on here that are not necessarily clear. There's a lot of districts that are not immediately clear to me. So I don't think they necessarily succeeded at what they were trying to do, but I think they were moving in the right direction at least, so you can tell that that's what they were trying to do. And just because they didn't do it perfectly doesn't mean they didn't do it. But yeah, there is sort of that debate as to whether or not this game looks good or not. Personally, I think the style is fine. I just don't think that it really does what they were advertising it as having done. But you know, the appearance of games is one of those really subjective things. I'm not going to really complain about it. I don't really care. For sound as well, the game has very, very atmospheric sound in the background. It is themed to the faction that you're playing as, to some extent. I think it's also influenced by the factions that you are near, or something. It's hard to tell for me exactly, because I'm not that worldly when it comes to music, to be honest. But I do think that there are changes when I'm fighting other people. Hard to tell for sure. And it's just nice background music. There's nothing fantastic. The intro music is pretty okay. It's not quite as good as Baba Yato, which I think is probably the seminal music for a Civilization game, and music for video games in general. If you haven't heard Baba Yato, I recommend checking that out. Along with the rest of the Calling All... Oh crap, what was that album called? Calling All Somethings. It's by Christopher Tin, and it's a fantastic one. It's the soundtrack for Civilization 4. And they've never made a soundtrack that's better than that, and I'm not sure that they ever will. It's just that good. But this game doesn't match up to that, but really nothing does. Okay, so don't worry too much about the fact that it doesn't live up to that. It would just be unrealistic to assume that it could. So other than that, though, I think that this game just is, all in all, a pretty good example of a 4X strategy game. I think that most people are going to agree that it is a pretty good 4X strategy game. I think that as well, if you're a newer player though, this isn't necessarily the best strategy game in this genre that you're going to want to play. I do think that there are easier ones out there to get into and to learn. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't play this game. I don't think that it's so horribly hard to get into that if you're a newbie player, you could not play this game. I think that to a very large extent, you probably could. It would just be not the easiest introductory one out there. For that, I actually think Beyond Earth is the best beginner 4X strategy game on the market. I'm not sure how many people would agree with me there, but I definitely feel like that's probably the case. So, you know, if you have a different idea, then go ahead and mention that in the comments. But I definitely feel like it's the simplest of this genre right now, and it's simple in a way that's still fulfilling and it's still good. And it gives you a pretty decent idea about how to play this. Like, I have a friend who hasn't played much Civilization in a while, and his favorite by far is Civilization Beyond Earth, to the point where he doesn't really even want to play this game just because it doesn't have a lot of the stuff that was in Civilization Beyond Earth. The other recommendation I would say, if you're completely brand new to this genre, Age of Wonders is a very simplified version of this that's more combat heavy and will feel to a lot of real-time strategy players a little bit more familiar, in my opinion. But I don't think it's as good a game as this is. This is a much better game, I would say, all in all. There's more strategic depth to it, there's more to learn, there's more that's more than just combat, which Age of Wonders is really just all combat, which I don't think is all that brilliant. So I think this is a better game, but there are easier games to ease yourself into. But still, you know, dive straight into this one. Take the time, learn it if you're feeling pretty good about that. I mean, realistically, if you don't feel like you've got the patience to learn this kind of game or play this kind of game, you're not going to like Age of Wonders probably either. So if it turns out that you don't like that game, you're definitely not going to like this one. And if you do like this game, then, well, you know, you like this game, and you probably don't need Age of Wonders. So, at the same time, I can understand definitely not going around and playing those other ones. Now, there are some elements to this game that I don't think are perfect or great, but they're sort of part of the scale of what makes a good 4X strategy game as well. So, all games in this genre have some element of luck, random chance, random luck, and this game is no exception to that. In my opinion, it is better in all cases to have less luck in the game. So if you have a chance to remove variability, I would say it's a good thing. Now, you do want a little bit of luck. You do want a little bit of random chance in these games. Like random starts, which allows for greater replayability. You want a little bit of that sort of reward from exploring. Because a lot of randomness in these games comes from exploring and the way that the map reveals itself to you. Not just in the sense of like where you can expand, because the map randomization means that every time you spawn a new map, where you can expand is going to be different. Like I've got a couple good expansion points around here and here, and you know, if I reset the game and it was a different map, maybe I find myself surrounded by too many city-states to expand properly, or by too many crappy tiles to expand properly, or anything like that. And that's an element of luck, but it's not one that really drives exploration. What drives exploration and is good luck in that sort of sense is the sort of little goodie huts that they litter throughout the map here. Other games like Endless Legend replace them with things like quests that you can use for experience and for money and stuff like that, and for advancement and all that other good stuff. So games of this genre tend to include some element of luck to try and compel people to explore the map and figure out as much as is possible about it before they continue along doing just whatever with their city. So it's not just hitting and turn over and over again while in city view, because, you know, that would be tremendously boring in the early game. But this game kind of puts themselves in not the best place for that sort of luck reduction, but they don't, like, I'm going to say what the best in that field is, in my opinion. I'd say that the best for luck management is Beyond Earth. The reason that Beyond Earth is the best for luck is that your start doesn't matter too much, because you don't have to use luxury resources. Luxuries are not as important in this game as it is in Civ 5, but it is still important. So you're often going to find that somebody is going to have really, really good starts with, like, say, 3 luxury resource tiles of unique luxuries in their city, as I have got here, and that's going to be really good for them. But you're going to find often you've got a city that starts with none, and that's a huge difference between those two different starts. So you're going to have one guy who's getting completely dicked over and one guy who's got everything. I don't particularly think that that's a good thing in this game. I don't think that that's something that you necessarily want to have happening. But it's not as bad as it is in some other games. Similarly with exploration, in this game you can find big chunks of techs. You can find boosts that are half of a tech. You can find a good chunk of religion, which is an important thing to be able to find early on, because you want to be able to get the first pantheon. Getting the first pantheon guarantees that you'll be able to get the most powerful ones of those, which means that you're most likely to dictate religion in the early game, or whatever it is that you're taking. And you could find a lot of other good things. It's not, again, as bad as Civilization 5. Civilization 5, instead of getting a boost to a tech, you would get a whole tech out of it, which is obviously quite a bit stronger. And you could end up getting, as well, absolutely nothing. So people could end up getting completely dicked over, or they could end up winning immediately because of the very early game finds. Beyond Earth, again, is the best, I think, in that sort of regard, because you could find pretty good things in Beyond Earth from goodie huts, but you couldn't find anything, like, really amazing. You couldn't find anything game-winning, in my opinion. It was just, like, you could find things that are beneficial, you could find things that give you a good kick, but there's so many on the map that everyone else is also going to find a whole bunch of them. They're usually just small boosts to science, or small boosts to energy, or small boosts to whatever. There are solar collectors, which are a big find, but I've never had a game where I didn't get one. And you need to hold on to that, so it's not an early game thing. You want to hold on to it until you've got 6 population. So, I mean, you end up in a situation where I think that Beyond Earth has by far the best early game scouting phase in terms of that sort of luck variability, without swatting people down while still simultaneously making it really strong for people to sort of wander around the map and explore, which I think is really what they want to incentivize with this. So I think that this sort of falls somewhere between in that sort of sense. I don't think that they're as good as Beyond Earth, but I don't think they're as bad as Civilization 5, which in that sense I think is the worst of the games. And I think that you know, this one hits a sort of happy medium. I still feel really compelled to sort of go out and explore the map, but I don't necessarily feel as though if I don't find all these goody huts that I'm going to instantly lose because of it. I don't feel like there's any real duds in these that make me want to just reset the game because they're so frustrating to get, like the map or the Barbarian Encampment find one. Like, for example, here I got Knowledge of Astrology, which is something that's actually really good. I did want to get Astrology. So we could even go ahead and go in here and switch our text because I need to get Astrology. That's something that I kind of need to get here. So I think that there's a lot of good things in this game that makes it a good example of a 4X strategy game. And I think that this is going to be one that people are going to be enjoying playing. One of the other things that's quite nice about this one is that it feels fairly complete. There's a lot of people who play 4X strategy games, and on release, a lot of them are kind of not great. Civilization 5 is one that people talk about. I would argue Civilization Beyond Earth is another example. These are games that came out, and they were fine, and people like me liked them on release, but there are a lot of people who thought they were not complete. They didn't have enough depth to them on start, and those were fixed through expansions and through other things like that. I think that this one actually came out strong. I think that this one doesn't need an expansion to feel complete, although to be fair, I felt that way about the other ones to a certain extent too. I didn't feel like I needed any additional content before I was happy with those other games as well. So even though despite that, though, this one does feel more complete than those other ones. It does have more elements to it. It does have more layered depth to it. It contains a lot of what existed in Brave New World, which is an expansion for this, or for Civ 5, which added a lot of elements to it that I think a lot of people really liked. So you are looking at a more feature-complete by default game, and I think that that's going to be something that people can appreciate. But if you're a newer player, I think that that's one of the reasons why I think that this is a slightly less ideal game if you're a completely new player to this. It's just not ideal to be playing as a completely new player to a series and having all those features, having all of those options, and having all of that complexity that comes about from having that kind of game. I think that less features is a little bit better perhaps when you're a completely new player, but you know, if you disagree with that, then definitely I think that this is going to be the sort of game that you'd like if you're the sort of person who's just like, yeah, no, I really want to dig into something that's really toothy right now. I think that if you're that sort of player, then you're going to definitely want to pick this one up. It is already there. And so I think that that's really what makes a great 4X strategy game, and I think that that's what's going to sort of draw in people who want to play this type of game and play this game in particular. Okay, after a brief cut there so I could collect my thoughts and stop rambling, because I do tend to ramble when I'm doing these, I want to talk a little bit about things that you might in particular not like in these sorts of games. So in this genre of game, typically the weakest parts of these are the beginning and ending of games. The beginning of these games tends to be a little bit boring because you tend to not really have much to do. You're just sort of moving around your scout a little bit. You're trying to sort of get those going. You're trying to sort of figure out maybe where you want to expand to, but you've got a lot of potential but not a lot to actually do yet. After all, you've only got a small number of units and you don't have that much that you can do with them. You've got tons and tons of space, but you don't have tons and tons of units to sort of fill that space or cities to fill that space. And your cities are growing slowly. They don't have much potential yet. You're not making much money. As you can see, we're making 5.5 gold per turn, which is pretty... there's nothing wrong with that. That's a fine amount, but at the same time, you would really love to be able to grow faster. And you can't really wage war in the early game that effectively. You can't really build up your empire that quickly. There's just tons of stuff that you can't do. You can't even necessarily plan for your victory. So these games in the early game, it's all about scouting. You want to figure out where everything is, and the more exciting the scouting phase, the better the early game of these games is going to be. I think that this game still has a pretty decent scouting phase, but it's not really too interesting. There's not really any major discoveries that's going to make it so that the early game is a lot of fun. You're still just moving a small, limited number of units, a small, limited amount of distance, and you're going to be like, okay, then I'm just going to do that real quick and then hit next turn. We want to get to the good stuff. We want to get to the point where we can start declaring war. We want to get to the point where we can start building tons of interesting wonders. We want to do, you know, X, Y, or Z, something that's a little bit more interesting than what you're doing at this point in the game. And I think that that's perfectly reasonable. while personally I don't have a huge problem with the early game of this game, it's definitely just leading into the much more interesting and fun parts of the game that come later. So I think that that's definitely going to be something that remains consistent with this game as compared to other games in the genre. I think that there's nothing inherently too wrong with that, though. There are very few games that have really tremendously interesting early games that are in this genre. But if you're new to the series and you're new to 4X strategy games, that's going to be something that might bother you a little bit. The other weakness to these sorts of games is the ending. So these games are, in my opinion, really all about the middle point of the game. And it's that sort of lead up into the middle part of the game that feels kind of exciting, where you start getting to the point where you've got really good units, you've got like a really nice set of cities, you've expanded a couple times, and things are looking really interesting, and you've got that satisfying feeling like you've got an empire, but you're still not necessarily going to be in a position to win the game. The problem with this sort of game is that you eventually hit this point where you're inevitably going to win. Like, if we look at our world rankings here, like, if we're going for a science victory, we have to build 3 specific parts after completing the technology tree. Excuse me there. So, if we go through all of this technology and we have like the most science in the game, and we got really fast science, we've got cities that are already building these 3 parts, it's probably going to take you like 20 turns to build these. And since you can check here to see how close other factions are to a victory, you could end up in a position quite often where you're a runaway contestant, where they just have no way to catch up to you, where it's just not even close, you're just going to dominate the game and crush it, but you still have to wait like 30, 40 turns, moving tons and tons of units around to try and fend off the last few feeble and meager attackers for the next like few hours, because once you've got empires that are that big, you've got a lot of moving parts. You've got tons and tons of stuff to micromanage. Like, you've got lots of trade units that you have to micromanage. You've got tons and tons of military units that you've got to micromanage. All of that other stuff is just really stuff that you need to focus on and pay attention to and move along. And it makes your turns take longer, but it's not really necessarily that satisfying if you know you're going to win. There's no tension left in the game. So long as you keep doing things correctly, you're going to win. I think that that's usually a weakness in these games, is that you can get that sort of snowball, and if you're having a tight, close game, then that's fine. That does happen sometimes, and those are very, very satisfying, but I find they're more rare than those times where I find myself, like, very, very close to that, say, cultural victory, and we're inching our way towards that cultural victory. We're trying to get to that last little tiny bit of it, and I know that everyone else is so far behind me that I'm inevitably going to win, so I'm just hitting next turn. I'm just hitting next turn over and over and over again. And, like, that's just not really that satisfying. That's not really that entertaining. You kind of want to be playing a game where you're kind of actually close to it. You're close on that edge there, which just doesn't happen in this genre of game, which I think is a real shame. So I think that if you really wanted that tight, close race, that fast race to the finish there between 2 nearly even nations, you're not necessarily going to find that in this genre of game. I think that that's quite rare. And because of this, it usually feels quite weak as you come to the ending. It feels like your opponents go out with more of a whimper than a bang. And I think that's just a weakness of the genre. Again, I don't think that there's really anything that they could have done to change that. But I definitely still think that it's worth it. Like, you don't actually have to finish these games. You don't have to play through to the very end. Quite often you'll be playing along and you'll find yourself, well, you know, we're at a point where I know for sure that I'm going to win. Why don't I just let the series wind down? Why don't I just stop playing the game? And that's fine. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. I think that that is something that more players should be able to do with their games. To play it until they're satisfied and then stop. You know, you don't have to win every single game. Of course, if you disagree with that mentality, this may not be the most fun experience to finish off for you. That's just how it sort of is. But at the same time, you know, you can always increase the difficulty. You can make it so that you've extended that tension period. A lot of the reason why you might find yourself having difficulty with one thing or another is because, or too much of an easy time with one thing or another, is because you've got it on the wrong difficulty, depending on how you're progressing. So you might find that, yeah, just set it on a higher difficulty. It'll make it so that you've got a much closer race to the finish. Now, the game's AI is not clever enough to make it really that difficult near the ending in any event, but it can still get pretty intense by contrast, so it is something that you might want to try doing. Personally, I think that the game is best when it's on a fairly medium difficulty, fairly difficult game, but nothing too crazy. Deity wasn't too fun. I think that for me, Emperor, but of course it's very customizable. You can switch around the difficulty to something more your taste, and I highly recommend that you go ahead and do that. It can mitigate that sort of late game crunch a little bit. Now, one of the other things that's interesting about this game in terms of difficulty, though, nice segue into that, is the barbarians in this game. And this also has a little bit to do with random chance. Now, barbarians in this game are extremely aggressive and extremely tough. We're having a pretty easy time with it here, but you can see that we're being attacked by quite a few barbarians. There's a camp spawning barbarians in the north, and there's this camp that is not spawning barbarians down in the south here. These ones are actually just this is just the camp guardian. They're not actually spawning anything at me yet, so that's good. But there's always that possibility that they'll start spewing out more barbarians at me like this one is. And the barbarians in this game are extremely aggressive. They're also very numerous. You're going to end up getting lots and lots of barbarians spawning fairly frequently, fairly quickly. And they attack you. They are relentless. They will send out waves of troops constantly. And it is absolutely miserable. You can find yourself getting surrounded by barbarians very early in the game. And it really sucks when that happens. You honestly don't want that to happen to you at all. And because of that, there's just sort of this element of frantically having to build units. And to me, building units is not necessarily that interesting in this game. Building lots and lots of military, it's not why I go into this game. It's about that sort of SimCity element to me. For me, it's about that sort of element of trade and diplomacy and all that other stuff. Because I'm that sort of player. Yeah, sure, I'll go on a conquering spree from time to time. The one that we actually saw me completing was a domination victory. I was playing as Montezuma, though, of course, so that's going to happen. But to me, being able to pursue those sort of peaceful pursuits and that city building is really a solid big part of this sort of game for me. It's one of the most important parts of this sort of game for me. So being forced to build lots and lots of units early on is kind of a pain. Like if I were to talk about other games, I would say that this is probably the most military that I've ever had to build up in the early game out of pretty much any of them. It is just brutal and ruthless as far as that goes. But at the same time, like, it does make for a slightly more exciting and dynamic early game, having to fight off these very aggressive barbarians very early on. Now, let's talk a little bit about the mechanics for this. Basically, every time the barbarians encounter you with your city, with their scouts, they will generate a wave of barbarians. They will send out like 3 barbarian warriors to the city that they scouted. That's going to be like a warrior, and it's going to be a slinger, or 2 warriors and a slinger. And they're going to come over and they're going to start fighting you. So that's 3 units. The reason that this can be so frustrating is because if you get spotted by 3 camps, which is purely based on luck near the beginning of the game, you could be spotted by 3 camps very, very early on, and these could be all sending their warriors at you at about the same time. So you could be fighting off 9 barbarians very early on. And if you're fighting off 9 barbarians very early on, this is extremely detrimental to you because you're building those troops that I mentioned. You're not functionally increasing the capacity of your city for quite a number of turns. You're going to be stuck doing that for 3-4 turns. You're going to have your tiles burned down, and it's going to be really just that sort of thing for the next foreseeable future. Whereas the players that are not being surrounded by barbarians are going to be building buildings. They're going to be building up infrastructure. They're going to be building up expansions. They're going to be building workers. They're going to be building trade. So there's a sort of unbalanced state that's just based around whether or not the barbarians see you because they're so dangerous. Whereas in Civilization 5, the barbarians, yes, they would spawn and they would frequently attack you, but you could easily handle a barbarian encampment with just 1 or 2 units. It's possible to handle barbarian encampments in this one with 1 or 2 units, but you could actually probably not handle more than 1 barbarian encampment. And since they spawn so aggressively here, it feels like you're often fending off huge waves of barbarians early on. So I think that there's some elements that are good about that sort of having to build lots and lots of military early on. It can definitely make things a little bit interesting. Like, we've got people, like, clearly the AI has more troops than I do, but we've only got 2 cities here, and there's only so much productivity that we can eke out of them. So, you know, what else can we really do? I mean, we could try and build some units, but that might not necessarily be the best idea, because we're going to start falling behind on other things pretty quickly there. If we don't get, for example, this district up very, very quickly, we won't get a religion. which would be detrimental to us. If we go here, we're probably already behind on great person points. If we look here, we're getting, we're kind of like second in great person points, it looks like, and we are third, but we're catching up, so maybe we'll be able to get one. Maybe we'll be able to get a great person before someone else does, but you kind of have to rush to get everything in this game, and that's sort of the case for everyone of this genre. Alongside the barbarians being extremely aggressive, though, you also find that the AI players are very aggressive. I've had people declare war on me by turn 50 on standard speed. We can see that both of these guys dislike me, so they're likely to declare war on me, Trajan especially. So while this isn't necessarily a bad thing, they often do this before the player can really realistically build up a huge response to it, or an effective response against it. So I don't think that that's particularly interesting personally. I think that if they declared more rational wars, and the reason I'm saying a more rational war is because often these wars are extremely to the detriment of the player initiating, the AI that's initiating these. And yeah, okay, maybe they think that my military is weak at the time, so they can probably bully me early on, but often they're building so much military up that they're screwing themselves over for the mid to late game in a way that a human player wouldn't. The AI is not terribly bright in this game, I don't think. But even accounting for that, they make a lot of very, very aggressive plays, which, you know, maybe you think that's a good thing, maybe you think that's not a good thing. I think that they're just a little bit too aggressive for a reason. I think that they're unreasonably aggressive, I should say, which, again, you know, maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, depends on your point of view there, but I do think that to a certain extent, though, it does make the game a little bit worse, just a little bit worse, that the barbarians are so swingy and so random, because if it was more consistent, I'd be happy with it. If the barbarians, you know, could only spawn like 2 near your city, perhaps, instead of the times where I've had like 3 barbarians spawn near my city, and as well, like if they're near horse resources or iron resources or anything like that, they get bonuses. They can spawn as swordsmen if they're near iron, they can spawn as horsemen if they're near horses, and if you're getting attacked by those early on before you've even teched up to them, those can be absolutely devastating. You can get completely wrecked by that. So I don't particularly think that that's the best mechanic for this game, just because of the way that they're so prevalent and so aggressive and so random. But, you know, even despite that, I think that that's not really a game breaker for me. I think that while it is annoying, it is pretty much just something that you do learn to manage. So if you're looking for a game that really feels like you're building up that empire just through SimCity, you can turn those off. I think that is almost something I would recommend people do if they're having a hard time with the rampaging barbarians. And I think that there's nothing wrong with that or anything like that. It's just something that I think you're going to have to keep in mind. It's a bit of an annoyance. It's a bit of a thing that happens in this game. So what else is there really to talk about? I think that's what we're going to talk about for now. We're going to leave the rest for our other video. We're going to be talking more in depth about the mechanics. Even if you're a new player to this, some of this is going to be useful information for you. So I highly recommend that you check that other video out. Of course, I'm going to recommend that you check the other video out, though of course that's something I'm going to recommend that you do. But it'll be talking more in depth about the individual mechanics of this game, some of the ones that are different from other Civilization games, and whether or not they're good or bad changes in particular. So anyway, I hope you found this video enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you all next time.